The winter of 1932 sounded like a vast machine grinding to a stop. America's engine cooling into silence. After the tent city on the Anacostia Flats was swallowed by MacArthur's flames, and Arthur fled with his pneumonia-stricken daughter cradled in his arms, hiding in the underground caverns of an abandoned coal town on the outskirts of Washington. Outside, the temperature plunged to 20 below. Icicles formed along the cave walls like blades. Rubbing the purpled fingers of his child between his palms, Arthur thought, "They burned us. So now, who are we supposed to cling to?" Roosevelt won a landslide in November, but the 4 months until inauguration became one of the darkest stretches in American history, an administrative vacuum. President Hoover, intoxicated by humiliation, vanished behind the heavy curtains of the White House. President-elect Roosevelt, saying he held no authority yet, stayed coldly silent. In the meantime, more than 4,000 banks collapsed in a chain reaction and shut their doors. Arthur stood before the iron shutters of his town's bank and watched the total sum of his life's sweat, $12, remain only as numbers in a ledger, evaporating forever. In the town square, riots became routine. People, driven past hunger, began looting grocery stores. Private guards, hired in place of police, fired live ammunition without mercy. Arthur chased garbage trucks and watched fathers scrape frozen cabbage skins from the street, seeing humanity drain from their eyes as something feral rose to fill the space. It was the true terror of the bottom, the dread of a nation in which the functions of the state had collapsed into a void. People stopped longing for freedom. They began longing for order, an order strong enough to hand them a single piece of bread. On Inauguration Day, beneath Washington's ash-colored sky, Roosevelt's voice poured from the loudspeakers, strangely gentle, yet unshakably firm. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Arthur swallowed hard. "My hunger is more real than fear. What is this man even looking at?" But Roosevelt was not merely an orator. Within 48 hours, he launched the Emergency Banking Act, forcing the nation's economic activity to halt. It was an exercise of power that normally belonged only to wartime, a bold gamble that briefly stopped the heart of capitalism. The state tightened its grip on the entire country's lifeline. People spilled into the streets in panic, and then, days later, the first fireside chat came through the radio, speaking with the warmth of a man sitting beside your living room hearth. "The banks are safe now. Put your money back." And, unbelievably, the next morning, lines formed not to withdraw cash, but to deposit it. Arthur trembled as he watched fear convert into relief in real time, and saw how quickly a single leader, through media, could stabilize the emotions of a vast public. To Americans, the state was no longer merely a government. It was becoming a god, one that promised survival. Roosevelt feared the millions of young men wandering the streets, angry, idle, and desperate. Before they could erupt into riots, they had to be gathered, managed, relocated. Thus, the Civilian Conservation Corps was born. To keep his family alive, Arthur once again put on the state's rough olive uniform. This time, he carried no rifle, only a shovel and a pickaxe. Deep in the forests of Virginia, inside camps organized like the military, Arthur worked 10 hours a day carving stone and planting thousands of trees. His monthly pay was $30, yet only 5 ever reached his hands. The remaining 25 was forcibly sent to his wife under the name Family Relief. It looked voluntary on paper, but when survival is on the line, choice becomes a word with no weight. By redirecting most wages straight to the family, the state redesigned the role of the breadwinner itself. Every time the 6 a.m. bugle called him to formation, every time he was summoned not by name, but by number, Arthur felt it. He was no longer a free father. He was a numbered component inside a giant machine. Yet, at night, in the barracks, the sounds were not only homesickness. There was also a strange pride, a choking gratitude, the relief of working again. The state guaranteed survival at the price of taking their wildness. On April 5th, 1933, Arthur stared at a poster on a newspaper stand and thought his eyes were lying. Executive Order 6102. All American citizens were ordered to surrender their gold coins and bullion to the Federal Reserve by May 1st. Disobedience meant a $10,000 fine or up to 10 years in prison. It was a direct assault on private property unlike anything the nation had seen, a frontal challenge to individual liberty. Arthur laid 2 gold coins in his palm, his grandfather's final bequest from the First World War, a last thread of dignity and the last lifeline he had refused to sell. But under the banner of national emergency, the state took private gold by force. Citizens lined up at banks holding their gold like criminals reporting for judgment. The government collected gold at $20.67 an ounce, then later raised the official price to $35, deliberately weakening the dollar's value. In effect, citizens who had held gold lost enormous real purchasing power. Arthur stared at the crisp stack of paper dollars placed in his hand and felt a chill run through him. If the state wants it, it can turn my value into paper overnight. My fate is now in the hands of whoever prints these notes. This was the moment dependence hardened, when people were pulled tighter into the system's orbit. The streets filled with posters at a near mad pace. The Blue Eagle, symbol of the National Industrial Recovery Act. We do our part. Over the radio, Roosevelt declared, "Any store that does not display the Blue Eagle is an enemy of the nation. Patriotic Americans must not do business there." It was a state-led boycott, an early form of loyalty screening. Arthur saw self-styled patriots posted outside a small bakery that lacked the Blue Eagle sticker, intimidating customers and denouncing the owner as a red shop. Merchants had to obey state-written codes on prices, working hours, and wages. Violations meant losing the Blue Eagle and immediate social death. The principles of the free market vanished. Only a controlled economy, breathing through government code, remained. Arthur sensed it. The Blue Eagle's cold eyes were not merely a symbol. They were a mechanism of surveillance, expanding the reach of central control deep into everyday life, turning neighbors into informants. Hunger was terrifying, but the fear of being branded by the state began to feel even worse. Order returned, yet the order carried poison, mutual suspicion. What happened in the countryside was even more grotesque. Under the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the state sought to raise farm prices by destroying production. Healthy cotton fields were plowed under, Millions of piglets were slaughtered and buried. While hungry children rattled tin cans in the streets, the government staged a theater of engineered scarcity, destroying food to protect prices. Landowners, eager to collect subsidies, drove out tenant farmers who had worked the soil for generations. "The government will pay us. We don't need you anymore." Arthur watched families forced onto trucks with their battered pots and pans, exiled from their own lives. At the same time, under policies pushed by local governments and federal agencies in the name of easing unemployment, Mexican communities were expelled on a massive scale, including American-born citizens. Arthur heard the screams at the station as neighbors were shoved onto trains and thrown across the border. He learned the cold truth. The state's good intentions are often reserved for the chosen. In crisis, the weak can be offered up as sacrifices. Behind every salvation, someone is forced to bleed. After economic ruin came nature's judgment. From the Great Plains rose dust storms so vast they swallowed the sky. Arthur watched Chicago turn black at noon, as if daylight itself had been extinguished. This black tear, born from reckless plowing and drought, filled lungs with soil. Livestock suffocated. Friends watched their homes disappear beneath drifting sand. Hundreds of thousands of Okies lost everything and began a long march toward California. Arthur saw arrogance return like a boomerang. Humanity tried to conquer the land, and the land answered with a sentence. The state created a soil conservation service and planted hundreds of millions of trees, but it was too late to return the lives already broken. The New Deal promised workers' rights, but on the ground, capital did not surrender easily. In the summer of 1934, the West Coast became a battlefield. Dock workers rose up. Police fired live rounds into crowds. Arthur stared at newspaper photographs of workers sprawled across asphalt, soaked in blood. After Bloody Thursday, the governor declared martial law. The National Guard rolled tanks into the streets. The same machines that had crushed veterans in Part 3 now aimed their barrels at civilians. Roosevelt managed the conflict while steadily expanding the federal government's role. Arthur understood something with brutal clarity. Rights are not gifts a president hands down. They are spoils, won when workers tighten the state's leash with their own blood. In 1935, the Social Security Act assigned every citizen a unique number, an SSN. From cradle to grave, the state now held the power to record Arthur's life in a permanent ledger. It was a rope that could keep you from starving when old or sick, and also a chain that converted a person into a number. At the same time, through the Federal Art Project, enormous murals praising the New Deal spread across public buildings. Arthur felt something uncanny staring at them. Happy workers smiling peacefully in paint, while real workers still fought for wages in the streets. The state fed artists and bought their brushes. It painted America's spirit in state colors. It was refined control in the language of welfare, an irreversible moment in which private life was absorbed into the machinery of administration. To placate homeless veterans, the state set up road-building camps in the Florida Keys. But when one of the most catastrophic hurricanes in history struck, officials in Washington hesitated, arguing budgets and procedures, delaying evacuation trains. In winds approaching 300 kilometers per hour, hundreds of veterans screamed as they drowned, tying themselves to trees in desperate knots, trying to stay alive. The next morning, the bodies of comrades were found in grotesque ruin, clothes torn away, faces destroyed. Arthur wept. MacArthur shot us with bullets. Roosevelt let us die. Once again, blood proved it. To the state, people can become consumables, used when needed, discarded when convenient.
Re-elected, Roosevelt tried to neutralize the Supreme Court by pushing the court-packing plan, an authoritarian idea aimed at ripping out a pillar of the Constitution. Then, in 1937, the moment government spending slowed, the economy plunged again. The so-called Roosevelt recession. After 8 years, it became clear. The Great Experiment was not a cure so much as a temporary brace. So Roosevelt turned his gaze outward. War clouds gathered in Europe and Asia, and America began reviving its munitions industry. Arthur was called back to the arms factories. A recovery strong enough to claim the Depression was truly over only accelerated once wartime mobilization began. As he wiped shells clean again, Arthur felt it in his bones. The giant had found bigger prey, and it was marching. By late 1939, Washington's sky was no longer filled with the sound of shovels and pickaxes. It throbbed with the engines of bombers. Arthur watched the electricity from the dams he had dug into the Tennessee River flow into aluminum plants, becoming the skeletons of fighter planes. The vast industrial infrastructure built under the New Deal became the foundation for rapid conversion into a wartime mobilization machine. Arthur remembered the state's boot that crushed him, and the same boot he licked digging for survival. The state gave him bread, yes, but it took his gold. It stamped him with a number, and now it demanded his very life under the banner of becoming the arsenal of democracy. Arthur understood. The New Deal giant, summoned to kill the monster of the Depression, had grown larger than the people themselves and was beginning to swallow them. Arthur leaned against the cold steel doors of a munitions factory, lighting a cigarette. Beside him marched young men, barely 20 years old, wearing fresh uniforms, faces bright with excitement. Just as Arthur had believed in 1918, they believed that bleeding for the nation was a sacred honor. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn Social Security card. We fought because we were abandoned. We obeyed to be saved. And in the end, what remained was only a number, an offering to the giant temple of the state. Arthur looked up. The New Deal's Blue Eagle had become a steel-winged aircraft, flying toward Europe's front lines. The state does not love the individual. It only manages them. The darkness of the Depression had lifted, but what replaced it was not freedom. It was the order of a giant machine. Arthur exhaled a long ribbon of smoke and wiped the dew that had formed on the shell he'd polished. Soon, with the sound of that shell exploding, the brutal season called the 1930s would finally, forever, set. Thank you for watching.